The story begins on a frozen ridge in Alaska, where a battle-worn veteran named Jim Walker climbs toward a cabin he never knew existed. The wind cuts like a blade, snow swirls around him, and his loyal German shepherd, Rex, suddenly freezes in place, ears up, body tense. Rex senses something deep beneath the ice. Not danger, something older, something calling. When Jim unlocks the cabin, the floor trembles under his boots, and Rex scratches at a hidden seam in the boards. What they uncover next doesn't just explain why Jim inherited this frozen cabin. It reveals a secret buried under the mountain that someone is willing to do anything to hide. Winterhold, a remote Alaskan town pressed between endless white plains and a rising wall of black rock mountains, looked as if winter had claimed it centuries ago and never let go. Snow piled knee-high along wooden porches. The air burned cold against skin, and the wind coming off the tundra howled through the abandoned mining shafts like a warning from an older world. Jim Walker moved through it with the steady patience of a man who had survived places far more brutal. At 50, with a weathered face shaped by war and years of silence, short military-cut hair peppered with gray, and steel-blue eyes that watched everything without expecting anything back, he blended into this frozen landscape as if he were carved from the same ice that swallowed its edges. Rex trotted beside him, leaving crisp paw prints behind them. The German shepherd was 7 years old, his black and tan coat thick from the Alaskan cold, and his amber eyes were sharp with the kind of awareness only working dogs carried. Rex rarely barked without reason, rarely relaxed until he scanned his surroundings twice, and always stayed close enough that his shoulder brushed Jim's leg every few steps. He was a broad-bodied dog with powerful muscles and a dignified stance, moving with the confidence of a companion who had once stood between Jim and danger too many times overseas. In Winterhold, he was both guardian and reminder of everything Jim had survived. That morning, Jim was clearing snow behind the supply shed, shoveling with the slow rhythm of someone who had done it too many winters to count. Snowflakes swirled around him, catching in the folds of his heavy dark green parka, the thick military-grade fabric stiffened by frost. His breath fogged the air in steady bursts. He appreciated work that didn't require conversation. Most residents of Winterhold respected that solitude, greeting him with nods rather than words when they passed him on the narrow, ice-slick main road. They knew he was a veteran, knew he lived alone in a rented room behind the diner, but they didn't ask for more. Winterhold was the kind of town where silence was a language of its own. Rex's sudden growl broke the rhythm. It wasn't loud. It was low, vibrating from deep in his chest, and Jim immediately straightened. Rex only made that sound for 2 reasons: immediate danger or someone approaching through heavy wind. Jim followed the dog's gaze and saw a snowmobile cutting through the storm, its headlights flickering like 2 pale stars. The rider slowed as she neared, bracing herself against the wind. When she dismounted, Jim recognized Mara Hensley, the county administrative officer responsible for delivering official documents to remote residents. She was a compact woman in her late 40s, bundled in a thick beige coat that made her appear even smaller, cheeks flushed from the cold, and strands of ash-blonde hair escaping from under her fur-lined hood. Mara was known in the region for her determined work ethic and for her ability to remain kind even when life in the north demanded bluntness. She trudged through the snow toward him, clutching a sealed envelope in her gloved hand as if it might blow away at any moment. "Mr. Walker?" she called, voice raised over the wind. Jim nodded once, leaning on his shovel, while Rex stepped between them with calm but unmistakable protectiveness. Mara paused, giving Rex a small, reassuring smile before addressing Jim again. "I'm glad I found you. The roads might close soon. I have something unusual for you." She held out the envelope with hesitation, as though unsure how he would react. Jim accepted the envelope, feeling the surprising weight of the thick paper inside. The seal bore the county's insignia. "What is this about?" he asked quietly, his voice rough from disuse. Mara shifted her weight. "It concerns a property registered under your family name. Elias Walker?" The name froze Jim more thoroughly than the wind could. His grandfather had been a stern, solitary man with rugged features, a gravel-deep voice, and hands roughened by a lifetime of mining. He vanished from Jim's life long before the military did, retreating into the mountains after the death of Jim's father. Jim barely remembered him. A shadow around a wood stove, a gruff warning not to wander too close to old shafts, a brief, unexpected tenderness when teaching young Jim how to read terrain lines on a map. "He passed years ago," Jim murmured. Mara nodded. "Yes, but his estate wasn't processed until now due to complications. You're his last living heir." She hesitated, then added, "He left you a cabin on Black Ridge Peak." Jim blinked against the snowflakes, stinging his eyelashes. A cabin? His grandfather had lived simply, never owning more than his tools and a stubborn will. A cabin clinging to a mountain slope didn't make sense. Mara continued. "There's also a handwritten note inside. I didn't read it, of course, but it looked unusual." Her expression softened. "Whatever this is, he wanted it to reach you." Jim slid a finger beneath the seal and opened the envelope. Inside was a deed printed on aged paper, coordinates typed neatly near the top, and a folded note written in a shaky but familiar scrawl. Rex pressed his nose to Jim's hand, sniffing the paper with focused intensity. Jim unfolded the note. The ink was faint but legible. "For the one who knows how to listen, something beneath the mountain is growing weak." A chill seeped deeper into Jim's spine, unrelated to the winter air. He read the lines twice, trying to hear his grandfather's voice hidden behind the words. Elias Walker was never poetic, never dramatic. If he wrote this, it meant something real. Rex suddenly stiffened, muscles tightening beneath his dense coat. His amber eyes locked onto the note as if he sensed something Jim couldn't. Jim placed his hand on the dog's back, steadying him, feeling the tension buzzing just under the surface. "Easy, boy," he murmured. But Rex wasn't reacting to a threat. Jim recognized this stillness. It was the same poised alertness the dog once displayed before discovering hidden explosives in desert soil, the same instinct he trusted without hesitation. Mara watched them both, uncertainty flickering in her hazel eyes. "I don't know what your grandfather meant," she said gently, "but I hope this helps you more than it confuses you." Jim folded the note carefully and slid it back into the envelope. The wind howled between the supply sheds, rattling loose tin panels. Something pulsed inside him. Curiosity, unease, and an old ache that felt like memory waking up. He hadn't thought of his grandfather's voice in decades, yet now it whispered between the lines of that message. "Thank you, Mara," he said, nodding once. She tightened her hood and stepped back toward her snowmobile. "Stay safe, Jim. The weather's turning ugly." With one last look at Rex, she rode off into the storm, her machine disappearing into a wall of white. Jim stood in the swirling snow for a long moment, envelope cold in his gloved hand. Rex nudged his thigh, urging him to move. The dog's breath fogged the air in sharp bursts, and his eyes flicked toward Black Ridge Peak, toward the silhouette barely visible through the storm. It was as if Rex already understood the direction their lives were about to take. Jim whispered, "You feel something, don't you?" Rex responded with a soft, low whine, the kind that carried warning, recognition, and loyalty all at once. And Jim, who trusted Rex more than he trusted most people, felt the truth settle quietly into place. He walked back toward town with Rex at his side, snow crunching under their boots and paws. The envelope felt heavier than before, as though it carried more than just paper inside. Perhaps a beginning he didn't ask for, but could no longer ignore. When he reached the door of his rented room behind the diner, he paused, looking once more toward the mountain ridge disappearing behind curtains of snow. Something waited for him there, something his grandfather believed only Jim would understand. And the dog at his side, tense and alert, seemed to agree. Whatever was weakening beneath that mountain, whatever had called to Elias Walker decades ago, was now calling to him. The climb toward Black Ridge Peak began before sunrise, when the sky was still a deep violet and the wind carried cold sharp enough to sting the skin. Jim Walker moved in steady, deliberate steps through the snow, his boots sinking deep with each stride. Rex trotted slightly ahead, his breath forming clouds in the air, ears rotating like radar dishes. The mountain slope rose jagged and unforgiving, its face carved by centuries of frozen storms. Jim's military cold-weather parka shielded him from most of the wind, but not the sense of being watched by the towering black basalt walls that loomed on either side of the narrow trail. The silence felt unnaturally heavy, as if the land were holding its breath. As they climbed higher, the path narrowed between two cliff ridges, creating a natural corridor where the wind roared and echoed like distant voices trapped in stone. Rex paused several times, nose lifted, scanning the air with tense precision. Jim trusted the dog's instincts without question. Rex had saved his life more than once overseas, detecting hidden dangers long before human senses could register them. Snow drifted across the trail in swirling ribbons, revealing patches of dark basalt beneath. Strange patterns appeared on the ground, thin cracks that spiderwebbed outward as if the mountain's surface had been stressed recently. Jim crouched and touched one, feeling a faint warmth beneath the ice where none should exist. Hours later, as the storm lightened, they reached a ridge overlooking a steep drop. From this vantage point, Jim finally saw the cabin his grandfather had left him. It clung to the mountain wall like a stubborn survivor, half built into the basalt itself. The front section was crafted from weathered cedar logs faded gray-white by decades of wind, while the rear half vanished directly into the stone, as though the mountain had swallowed it. A circular window near the roof glowed faintly with reflected light, giving the building an eerie, watchful appearance. Rusted steel reinforcement bands wrapped around the structure, evidence of Elias Walker's practical mind and hands hardened by mining work. Jim stopped in the snow, studying the place with a mixture of caution and awe. Rex stood beside him, tail rigid, body angled toward the cabin as if he were preparing for an invisible threat. The wind died momentarily, leaving a startling stillness around them. Jim heard it then, a faint, rhythmic thrum rising from somewhere beneath the cabin. It was too subtle to be machinery, too steady to be natural. The sensation crawled through the ground and into his boots, like a heartbeat buried deep under the basalt. Rex reacted immediately. The dog lowered his head, nose pressed to the snow, and stepped forward with deliberate slowness, his muscles taut. They approached the cabin carefully. The wood panels creaked as the wind brushed them, and a thin layer of frost coated the doorframe. Jim ran a gloved hand across the cedar logs. The surface was colder than the surrounding air, an unnatural chill that bit through the glove. He leaned closer and heard the faint vibration again, pulsing through the wood. Rex pressed his nose against the wall, exhaled, then looked sharply at Jim with narrowed eyes. It wasn't fear. Jim recognized it as the same heightened awareness Rex displayed before uncovering hidden explosives. Something inside the mountain was moving, whispering its presence through the structure his grandfather had built. Jim stepped around the side of the cabin and inspected the steel reinforcement bands bolted into the rock. The bolts were old but held firm, though some of the metal showed signs of stress, the kind caused by shifting pressure inside the stone rather than age. He crouched to examine the base of the cabin where cedar met basalt. A thin line of frost rose from the seam, drifting upward like smoke. Jim frowned. Basalt should not release warm air in the middle of winter. The mountain felt alive, radiating a slow internal heat that contradicted the freezing air. Rex circled the cabin twice, sniffing intently, before stopping at a particular section where the stone curved inward. The dog placed both paws against the rock and pressed his muzzle close, inhaling sharply. Then his entire body stiffened. Jim moved quickly to his side. The basalt wall behind Rex vibrated subtly beneath Jim's glove, each pulse perfectly timed, steady, deliberate. It felt like a message transmitted through stone. Jim whispered, "What did you find, boy?" Rex's ears flattened briefly, then stood sharp and alert as he nudged the stone repeatedly, urging Jim to understand. Jim scanned the area and noticed shallow grooves carved into the basalt. They weren't natural fractures. Someone had etched them intentionally long ago, rough symbols, half hidden by frost, as if someone had tried to warn whoever arrived here. Jim turned back to the cabin door and brushed off the frost-covered handle. The metal felt warm. Not from the sun. There was no sunlight reaching this part of the peak, but from something internal. He pushed, expecting resistance, but the door opened with a soft groan, as though the cabin recognized him. Inside, the air was stale but strangely warm, carrying the scent of cedar, old machinery, and faint minerals. Dust glittered in beams of pale light entering through gaps in the window. A small wood stove sat in the center, its pipe vanishing into the rock wall. Shelves lined the far side, filled with notebooks, maps, jars of stones, and handcrafted tools. Everything seemed arranged with purpose, untouched for years, yet waiting. Rex entered first, moving silently across the wooden floor. The dog sniffed the ground and then froze in front of the wall where the cabin connected to the mountain. He stared at it with an intensity Jim had only seen in the most dangerous moments of their past. Jim approached the shelves, scanning the titles of the notebooks. Many were labeled EW in blocky handwriting. Others contained geological sketches drawn in blue ink. One loose sheet held a hand-drawn cross-section of the mountain with a long streak of blue cutting through it, labeled Primary Vein. Another was marked with a shaky note. Still weakening. Must listen deeper. Not enough time. Jim felt a tightness in his chest as he glanced around the room. Elias Walker had lived alone in this unforgiving place, studying something the rest of the world ignored. He had left clues, notes, sketches, warnings, because he knew someone would eventually come looking. Jim set down the paper and rested one hand against the basalt wall. The vibration pulsed beneath his palm again, steady, rhythmic, alive. It wasn't merely geological instability. It felt intentional, like a distant voice murmuring through the bones of the mountain. Rex pressed against Jim's leg, eyes locked on the stone as though awaiting a response. Jim whispered into the still cabin air. "What were you trying to tell me, Grandpa?" Rex lifted his head and let out a soft, low sound that resonated with the same rhythm as the vibration inside the basalt. The cabin fell silent again, but Jim felt something shift deep within him, an understanding forming not through logic but instinct. His grandfather had left him more than a cabin. He had left him a responsibility. Whatever lived beneath this mountain, whatever was weakening, had begun revealing itself. And Jim knew he could no longer turn away. Something ancient and fragile was calling for help, and the only ones listening were him and his steadfast dog. Rex circled the cabin floor with increasing urgency, his claws tapping sharply against the aged wooden planks. Jim Walker watched him closely, noting the precision in the dog's movements. Rex wasn't wandering. He was tracking something beneath the boards. The vibration Jim had felt earlier seemed stronger now, pulsing faintly with each step. Suddenly Rex stopped and lowered himself into a crouch, nose pressed tightly against a narrow seam in the floor. His ears snapped forward. Jim knelt beside him, running his fingers along the groove until he found a tiny metal ring flush with the wood. "Good work, buddy," he whispered. The ring was cold, almost unnaturally so, and felt untouched for decades. Jim braced himself and pulled. The floor panel lifted with a muffled metallic click, revealing a recessed compartment reinforced with steel edges. A rope ladder dangled into darkness below, the air rising from the opening cool and tinged with minerals. A faint, rhythmic hum drifted upward, like distant water speaking through stone. Rex stood rigid at the edge, tail straight, amber eyes tracking every sound. Jim lowered a flashlight into the shaft and saw smooth basalt walls descending about 12 feet. It wasn't a random hole, it was engineered. Elias Walker had built this deliberately, with skill and intent. Jim inhaled slowly. His grandfather had lived a life far deeper than anyone knew. Jim descended first, gripping each rung carefully. The ladder was old but solid, anchored by thick iron hooks drilled into the basalt. At the bottom, his boots landed on packed earth mixed with fine dust. The flashlight revealed a small underground chamber roughly the size of a single-room office. Wooden beams supported the ceiling, their ends embedded into the stone. A work table stood near the far wall, cluttered with notebooks, folded maps, and small vials filled with sediment samples. A machine resembling a hydrophone sat at the center, wires wrapped in cloth insulation. Rex followed him down, sliding skillfully as only trained working dogs could. When the dog hit the ground, he shook off dust and moved immediately toward the work table. Jim switched on an old lantern mounted low on the wall, its weak solar cell still holding a charge. A warm glow filled the chamber, revealing the sheer volume of research Elias had compiled. Maps plastered the stone walls, drawn in blue ink that shimmered under the lantern light. Most displayed the Black Ridge Peak region, but some showed deep cross-sections, labeled with pressure gradients and directional arrows. One central diagram caught Jim's attention. A thick blue line running through the mountain's interior, annotated Black Ridge Vein, primary flow channel. Notes written in Elias's craggy handwriting surrounded it. Pressure dropping annually, harmonic frequency weakening, and flow disruption detected. Cause unknown. Rex nudged one of the notebooks toward Jim. The cover was scratched. Leather, edges softened by years of handling. Jim flipped it open. Inside were pages filled with dates spanning 27 years. Each entry noted water clarity, vibrational readings, seasonal shifts, and flooding anomalies. One page bore a clear warning. If the vein collapses, the northern wells will fail. The mountain will drain from within. Jim felt a cold weight in his chest. This wasn't eccentric rambling. It was structured, scientific observation. Elias hadn't been alone down here. He had been fighting time. Another page mentioned trucks. Northfront Resources vehicles sighted at 0057, 0114, SO2 and O2, nightly. Jim had seen those trucks before in town, always avoiding eye contact, always carrying equipment. The hydrophone device on the table was patched together with precision. An aluminum casing reinforced with bolts, a set of old headphones, and a dial connected to a water pressure sensor. Jim placed the headphones over his ears and flipped the switch. First came static, soft and crackling like snow on a radio antenna. Then a low tone emerged, steady, pulsing. Jim adjusted the dial, sharpening the signal. Suddenly a deeper vibration roared through the line, rhythmic and strained. It felt like something massive struggling beneath the rock, like water forced through a narrowing passage. Jim clenched his jaw. This wasn't natural erosion. Something was compressing the flow. Rex pressed his head against Jim's thigh, sensing the tension. Jim examined the sediment vials next. Each was labeled by coordinates and year. The older samples were clear, glass-like. The newer ones, especially those from the last 2 years, held cloudiness and subtle discoloration. One sample was marked, "After North Front's move-in." Inside the vial, tiny particles drifted like dust suspended in water. Jim shook it gently and watched as heavier fragments settled unnaturally fast. Contamination. Something was entering the groundwater system. Rex's ears perked suddenly. The dog approached the base of one wall, nose quivering. Jim grabbed the flashlight and followed. A crack ran through the stone. Thin but recent. Warm air seeped through it, carrying a faint metallic scent. Jim pressed his hand to it and felt the mountain trembling softly like a labored heartbeat. A small metal box sat under the table, partially hidden. Jim pulled it out. Inside were letters sealed in wax, addressed to no one. The top one had a shaky inscription, "For the one who listens." Jim opened it and found a message from Elias, written in rushed strokes. "If you are reading this, the vein is failing faster than I feared. The trucks are taking more than they admit. They're draining what keeps the mountain alive. Someone must stop them. If not me, then you." Jim stared at the words, breath stuck in his throat. His grandfather had predicted this moment. He had left warnings, clues, and now a burden passed into Jim's hands. Rex leaned into him, offering silent strength. Jim scanned the remaining documents. Many pages contained sketches of drilling rigs and pump systems, the kind used by industrial extraction companies. One drawing was stamped with a name: North Front Resources, Model D12 Deep Pump. Jim recognized it instantly. He'd seen the same model parked behind the lumberyard a week before. Elias had mapped out their illegal drill sites, marking points where pressure had collapsed. One site was dangerously close to the cabin. Jim folded the paper and pocketed it. He heard a faint clicking sound above. The cabin settling? Or something else? Rex lifted his head, ears sharp, muscles tense. Jim extinguished the lantern and climbed the ladder with Rex right behind him. The cabin's interior was dim, but unchanged. Yet the air felt different, colder, heavier, as if the mountain had exhaled deeply. Jim secured the floor panel back into place. He stepped towards the window and peered outside. Snow continued to fall gently. But far down the slope, near the tree line, a pair of headlights flickered faintly before going dark. Jim's pulse tightened. Someone else knew about this place. Maybe they had followed the vibrations. Maybe they were watching. Rex growled softly, his gaze locked on the same distant point. Jim's instincts sharpened. Everything Elias warned about was happening now. The mountain was weakening, the enemy was aware, and he and Rex were standing in the middle of a problem bigger than anything they had faced overseas. Jim stepped back from the window, letting the cold realization settle. Elias hadn't built a hideout. He had built a warning chamber, a final stand against forces wearing corporate logos instead of uniforms. Jim looked down at Rex. "We're not just inheriting a home, boy," he murmured. "We're inheriting a fight." Rex pressed his head against Jim's hand, confirming silently that they would face it together. The vibrations beneath the floor throbbed again, deeper this time, almost pleading. Jim tightened his parka, squared his shoulders, and realized something unmistakable. The mountain wasn't just calling, it was running out of time. Jim Walker reached Winterhold's main street just as the late morning clouds thickened over the small Alaskan town. His boots crunched through the hard snowpack, while Rex stayed close to his left side, the dog's breath forming short bursts of steam in the cold air. Jim moved with purpose, carrying the folded maps, notes, and sediment samples he recovered from the underground room. He knew exactly where he needed to go. The Frostline Geological Office sat near the edge of town, a squat cedar building with metal shutters to withstand harsh storms. Inside worked Dr. Arlo Bishop, the only geologist within 80 miles, and a man reputed for blunt honesty and a sharp, analytical mind. Jim stepped inside and found Dr. Arlo Bishop hunched over a drafting table beneath a dim lamp. Bishop was in his mid-50s, tall but slightly stooped from years bent over field equipment. His graying black hair fell in uneven strands over a lined forehead, and a narrow pair of rectangular glasses sat low on his strong, angular nose. His cheeks were hollow, weathered by decades of cold expeditions, and a trimmed salt and pepper beard lined his jaw. Despite his stern exterior, there was a quiet patience in his hazel eyes, the patience of a man who listened more than he spoke. When Bishop looked up and saw Jim, his eyebrows rose with surprised recognition. Jim laid the documents on the table without explanation. Bishop adjusted his glasses and began scanning the first page. As he flipped through the notebooks and diagrams, the color drained from his face. He paused on a map marked with Elias Walker's shaky notes, studying the weakening pressure gradients. "Where did you get these?" Bishop asked, voice low and measured. Jim explained briefly. His inheritance, the cabin, the hidden room, the hydrophone recordings. Bishop listened intently, his expression tightening with each detail. When Jim finished, Bishop closed the notebook slowly, as though worried the paper might crumble. "These readings aren't normal," he said. "They're dangerous. Pressure is collapsing faster than surface conditions can explain. Something is forcing the water away." Bishop pulled out a fresh sheet of graph paper and began sketching rapid calculations, his pencil moving with controlled urgency. Rex sat beside Jim, watching Bishop with steady, intelligent eyes. The geologist muttered to himself, "Flow shift, harmonic distortion, structural decay." Then he looked up sharply. "This is induced," he said. "Not natural. Someone is draining the primary vein." Jim felt his jaw tighten. Bishop continued. "If Northfront Resources installed unauthorized pumps inside the ridge, they could be creating vacuum pockets. That would destabilize the basalt layers. A collapse wouldn't just affect the mountain. It could destroy Winterhold's entire water table." Jim's stomach sank. So Elias had been right. And Northfront wasn't just careless. They were dangerous. Bishop leaned back, rubbing his forehead with calloused fingers. "Your grandfather must have known what was happening. Elias Walker understood these mountains better than anyone. These records are meticulous. He was tracking something catastrophic." Jim swallowed hard. Bishop leaned forward and pointed at one diagram where the pressure line plunged downward. "If this trend continues, we could see a full vein rupture. That means sinkholes, poisoned water, or worse, a blowout inside the ridge." Jim asked what could be done. Bishop's answer was grim. "We need more evidence, hard proof. Northfront is powerful, and they won't stop just because someone asks nicely." Jim nodded, feeling the familiar weight of responsibility settling across his shoulders like a rucksack. Jim left Bishop's office at dusk, the sun slipping behind the mountains with a faint orange glow. Rex trotted beside him as they made their way back toward Black Ridge Peak. Snow fell in soft, slow spirals, masking their footprints as they climbed the slope. Jim replayed Bishop's words over and over in his head. The pressure collapse wasn't just a scientific anomaly. It was a manufactured disaster. When the cabin came into view, a thin river of smoke curled lazily from the chimney, though Jim hadn't lit the stove since morning. His steps slowed. Rex suddenly stiffened. The dog's ears pricked sharply, nose lifting toward the air as he inhaled deeply. His muscles tightened. Something was wrong. Rex sprinted toward the cabin, stopping abruptly beneath the wooden porch where the wind funneled the cold. He lowered his head and sniffed intensely along the lower beams. Jim followed quickly. As he knelt, a faint metallic odor hit him. Sweet, sharp, unmistakable. Gas. His pulse spiked. Jim moved along the porch edge and found a hairline crack along one of the old metal pipes beneath the cabin. The smell was strongest here. Cold gas hissed softly from the damaged line, forming a thin cloud that drifted under the floorboards. If he had lit the wood stove tonight, the cabin would have become a fireball. Jim clenched his fists. This wasn't decay. Someone had tampered with the pipe. Jim backed away, steadying his breath, analyzing the damage the way he had been trained to assess sabotage overseas. The split in the pipe was too clean to be natural from cold pressure. It looked pried open. A tool had done this. Someone had approached the cabin while he was gone. Someone confident enough to walk up the mountain trail in daylight. Rex growled low, pacing around the perimeter, searching for a trace. Jim scanned the snow. Faint tracks, boot prints, were already half buried but still visible. They led toward the trees, then vanished where the wind had erased the trail. Whoever had done this knew how to cover their tracks. Jim exhaled slowly. Winterhold was not as safe as it pretended to be. Inside, Jim opened every window to vent the remaining gas, letting a rush of freezing air invade the small cabin. Rex stayed glued to his side. The dog's instincts were heightened, eyes scanning the shadows, muscles coiled. Jim checked the stove, the matches, and the lanterns. He searched thoroughly for other signs of tampering. A loose screw on the back door latch, a shifted plank under the window frame. Subtle, but familiar to a man who had spent years spotting improvised dangers in hostile territories. Someone had entered the cabin, or at least tried to. Jim felt tension climb up his spine. This wasn't just about stealing water anymore. They wanted witnesses gone. Jim sat at the table, lit only by the pale moonlight through the circular window. Rex sat beside him, chest rising and falling steadily. Jim unfolded Bishop's quick sketches, Elias's old notes, and the map showing the failing water vein. Everything pointed to one truth. Someone wanted the mountain's secret to stay buried. And they were willing to silence anyone who knew. Jim reached out and laid his hand on Rex's head. He whispered, "They made their first move." Rex's eyes glowed in the silver light, unwavering, loyal, ready. Jim stared toward the dark forest outside. Enemy tactics were familiar. They always began with quiet warnings. But Jim Walker had survived far worse than shadows in the snow. The Winterhold Town Hall was already crowded when Jim Walker and Dr. Arlo Bishop arrived that cold morning. Snow slid off the slanted roof as people filed inside, their breath hanging in pale clouds. Jim, wrapped in his military cold-weather parka, scanned the room with the alertness of someone who'd spent years walking into unstable situations. Rex walked at his heel, the German shepherd's amber eyes focused and attentive. At the front sat the council members, flanked by townspeople desperate for answers. And standing near the podium were 3 representatives from Northfront Resources, well-dressed, stiff-backed, and watching the crowd as though judging which questions they would need to dodge. One of Northfront's key representatives stepped forward. Victor Lang, a man in his early 40s with a clean-shaven jaw, high cheekbones, and slick black hair combed sharply to the side. He wore a tailored charcoal suit and a heavy navy overcoat draped over his arm, suggesting he valued appearance more than function. His pale blue eyes carried an unsettling confidence, the kind often found in men accustomed to controlling conversations. He nodded politely to the council before speaking with a rehearsed calmness. Northfront remains fully compliant with all regional regulations, he said. Any implication otherwise is rooted in misunderstanding, not fact. Jim felt his jaw tighten. Dr. Arlo Bishop stepped up next, unfolding detailed pressure charts and sediment reports. He spoke firmly, his voice carrying the authority of a field-hardened geologist. The Black Ridge vein is collapsing, Bishop said, pointing at the descending pressure lines. This isn't natural. These readings coincide with repeated nocturnal truck activity on the ridge. Murmurs rippled through the hall. Several residents, including elderly trappers and young families, whispered anxiously. Jim watched Victor Lang's expression shift only slightly, a tightening around the eyes. Rex sat beside Jim, posture tall, eyes fixed forward. Jim noticed Lang's foot tapping a quick, irritated rhythm. Victor Lang countered with cold precision. Pressure fluctuations occur every winter. Basalt structures shift. This, he tapped Bishop's chart, is selective interpretation. Northfront has invested millions in safe infrastructure. His smile was thin, clipped at the edges. Behind him stood 2 assistants, a burly man named Carter Doyle with a shaved head and thick reddish beard, clearly hired for intimidation rather than brains, and a woman in her 30s named Elena Rivers, slim with shoulder-length dark brown hair and a stern demeanor. Elena's almond skin and sharp hazel eyes reflected a person who followed orders meticulously. Jim studied them both, noting how Elena avoided eye contact, while Carter glared at anyone staring too long. The council chair, a heavy-set older man named Roland Tripp with bushy gray eyebrows and a weather-worn face, cleared his throat. We need truth, not deflection, he said. Jim stepped forward, presenting Elias Walker's notes and the vials of discolored water. My grandfather documented 27 years of consistent readings, Jim said. The vein didn't collapse until Northfront moved equipment up the ridge. People murmured louder now. Victor Lang's calm exterior cracked briefly. He leaned toward Jim. Anecdotes and nostalgia aren't scientific evidence, he hissed softly, though the microphone picked up every word. Bishop stepped between them with a cold stare. Rex suddenly stood, posture rigid, ears shooting upward. Jim froze. He knew that stance. Rex inhaled sharply, then barked once, short, urgent, a sound Jim had learned long ago meant one thing: imminent danger. People startled at the sudden noise. Jim's pulse spiked. Easy, Rex, he murmured, but the dog didn't waver. Rex bolted across the hall, heading toward the side maintenance corridor. Jim sprinted after him. The crowd parted in confusion. Bishop followed quickly, while Victor Lang scowled as if being inconvenienced. Rex skidded to a stop near a locked utility door and scratched furiously at the bottom edge, whining low. Jim crouched, sniffing, then smelled it. Gas. His eyes widened. Jim shoved his shoulder into the door, breaking the old latch. Inside, a corroded pipeline ran along the wall, vibrating violently. A fresh fissure had opened along the seam, hissing gas into the room. The pressure meter needle trembled in the red zone. One spark, One furnace ignition, and the whole building could explode. Jim's military instincts surged. "Everyone out of the hall!" he yelled. The shout carried across the room. Council members, residents, even North Front representatives turned pale. Bishop grabbed the wall intercom and repeated the order. Panic erupted. Chairs scraped. People rushed for exits. Jim twisted the emergency shutoff valve, muscles straining. Rex barked, pacing, ready to pull him back if the pressure ruptured fully. As the valve resisted, Jim braced his boots and forced it with a grunt. The pipe groaned. Then the hiss began to fade. Bishop rushed in with a fire extinguisher, spraying the area to displace residual fumes. The rumble beneath the hall quieted. Jim backed away, breathing heavily. Rex pressed close to him, tail rigid, eyes still sharp. Council Chair Roland Tripp staggered into the hallway, face pale. "That pipe hasn't been inspected in 20 years, he muttered. "If that had gone—" He looked at Rex with awe. "Your dog just saved this town hall." Jim nodded, grateful and furious, because accidents didn't happen twice in 2 days. As the evacuation settled, the council reconvened outside in the snow-covered square. Victor Lang attempted to salvage his position. "Old pipelines fail," he said, forcing a confident tone. "Coincidence, nothing more." But the townspeople were no longer listening. Even Elena Rivers, Northfront's stern assistant, looked shaken. Her arms were crossed, but her shifting gaze hinted she suspected more than she could admit. Carter Doyle stood stiff, jaw clenched, visibly annoyed the event had turned against them. Jim crossed his arms over his parka, his expression unyielding. "Coincidence doesn't explain trucks at midnight," Jim said. "Or contamination, or a pipeline ready to explode the same week Northfront is accused." Whispers swelled among the townspeople. Roland Tripp raised a hand for silence. "This changes everything," he declared. "We will open a full investigation into Northfront resources. Their claim of compliance is no longer credible." Bishop nodded firmly beside Jim. Rex sat proudly at Jim's side, chest lifted, the dog's amber eyes bright with purpose. Victor Lang's expression curdled, anger, panic, calculation, before he masked it again behind corporate calm. But it was too late. The crowd saw the truth before them, a company cornered, a veteran telling the truth, and a dog who had just prevented a disaster they could not deny. As the crowd dispersed, Jim rested his hand on Rex's head, feeling the warmth beneath the thick fur. Snowflakes drifted around them like ash. Bishop approached, rubbing frost from his beard. "You realize this wasn't an accident," Bishop said quietly. Jim nodded. "They wanted to scare us, maybe silence us." Bishop exhaled sharply. "Well, they failed, and now the town's watching." Jim looked toward the distant ridge where headlights had vanished nights before. Whatever Northfront was trying to hide, they were running out of time, and Winterhold was waking up. The blizzard arrived earlier than any forecast predicted. Winterhold vanished behind a curtain of white, and the wind screamed against the cabin walls like a living thing. Jim Walker stood near the circular window, the faint glow of his lantern flickering across his weathered face. Rex lay by the door, but was not resting. His ears twitched constantly, reacting to every tremor of wind. Jim tightened the collar of his military cold-weather parka and stepped outside to secure loose firewood. The cold hit him like a fist. Snow blasted sideways, reducing visibility to mere feet. As Jim worked, Rex suddenly burst out of the cabin and barked sharply into the storm, a deep warning followed by a frantic whine. Jim froze. Something or someone was out there. Rex ran forward, nose cutting through the violent snow. Jim followed, leaning into the wind that nearly shoved him backward. The storm swallowed sound, but Rex stopped again, barking with urgency. Jim jogged to his side and knelt. Through the whiteout, a faint, rhythmic thudding echoed. Metal on ice. Jim recognized distress immediately. He pulled a small searchlight from his jacket, shielding it from snowfall until the beam pierced the swirling white. The shape of a large industrial vehicle slowly emerged. A north front transport truck stuck against a ridge split, half buried in compacted snow. Its hazard lights flickered weakly, one headlamp smashed. The truck looked crushed by a sudden avalanche. Jim narrowed his eyes. The workers inside had minutes, maybe less. Jim reached the truck's cab door and yanked it open. Inside, 3 men were crammed together, shivering violently. The driver, a broad-shouldered man in his late 30s with a patchy beard and a gash above his eyebrow, gasped in shock. His ID badge read, Mark Redden. The second man, Luis Carranza, younger, early 30s, slim and sharp-featured with dark curly hair and olive skin, coughed weakly into his sleeve. The third, Evan Holt, mid-20s with sandy hair, freckles, and thick gloves torn at the seams, was drifting into hypothermia. None of them wore proper cold gear. Their company jackets were far too thin for the blizzard. Jim's voice cut through the roar of the storm. "Move. Now," Rex barked sharply, as if seconding the order. Mark Redden struggled free first, staggering as Jim supported his weight. Luis followed, clutching a small metal case he seemed unwilling to drop despite his trembling hands. Evan Holt had barely enough consciousness to walk, so Jim slung Evan's arm over his shoulder, taking most of the man's weight. "Rex, home!" Jim shouted. Rex immediately headed toward the cabin, pausing after several yards to ensure Jim and the workers followed. Jim ordered Mark and Luis to stay close, but the blizzard pushed at them like a wall. Snow stung their eyes. Jim felt the familiar pulse of survival mode. Calculating wind angles, time to shelter, the physical limits of freezing bodies. Evan's legs buckled once, but Jim hauled him upright without breaking stride. Progress was agonizingly slow. The storm thickened, swallowing every sound except the furious wind. Rex remained visible only by the dark silhouette against white, glancing back every few seconds to guide them. Luis stumbled and fell to one knee, nearly dropping the metal case. Jim pulled him up. Mark Redden shouted something, but the wind smothered his voice. As they climbed a narrow slope near a cluster of fir trees, a sharp cracking noise thundered overhead. Jim looked back. Another sheet of snow peeled off the ridge, starting to slide. A second avalanche. "Move!" Jim roared. Rex sprinted ahead, and Jim pushed the 3 men with everything he had. Snow slammed behind them in a roaring wave, missing by only seconds. When they finally reached the cabin, Jim forced the door open and ushered the men inside. Rex shook off snow, pacing the small room anxiously. Jim lowered Evan Holt onto a chair by the stove, then lit the fire only after double-checking that gas lines were secure. Warmth slowly filled the room, thawing frozen hands and faces. Mark Redden held his bleeding forehead and stared at Jim with disbelief. "You saved our lives," he said, voice raw with cold and guilt. Luis Carranza clutched the metal case tightly, even as his fingers shook. Rex sat in front of him, observing him with intelligent suspicion. Jim noticed it too. "What's in the case?" Jim asked. Luis hesitated, took a breath, then opened it. Inside were stacks of printed logs, pressure graphs, pump rate sheets, and internal memos stamped with Northfront Resources Confidential. Luis's voice trembled as he spoke. "We didn't know at first, but the deeper we drilled, the worse the readings got. They told us to ignore the warnings. They told us to delete everything." Evan Holt lifted his head, exhaustion in his eyes. "They made us run the pumps harder. The mountain is collapsing from the inside." Mark Redden nodded slowly, shame clouding his expression. "We were afraid to speak, until the avalanche. We thought we were dead. So," he gestured weakly to Jim, "we're done being quiet." Jim spread the documents across his table. The data matched and expanded everything Elias Walker had recorded. Unauthorized pumps, altered environmental reports, pressure spikes moments before equipment shipments, even signatures from executives authorizing the operation. Rex sniffed at the pages, tail lowered. Jim felt his chest tighten with a grim certainty. This was the proof Bishop needed. This was the smoking gun Winterhold needed. The storm howled outside like a beast in pain, rattling the cabin walls. Jim looked up at the three men. All of them bore the weary, haunted look of people forced to choose between survival and conscience. Luis wiped melted snow from his dark hair and said, "People need to know. We'll testify." Jim made them drink warm broth while the storm raged relentlessly. Rex curled at the base of the door, guarding it like a sentinel. The men slowly regained color in their cheeks. Jim checked Evan's pulse and confirmed the young worker was recovering from near hypothermia. The blizzard outside reached its peak, shaking the cabin violently. Jim scanned the documents again. Each page confirmed illegal drilling into the Blackridge primary vein. Every sheet was a nail in Northfront's coffin. As the hours passed, Mark, Luis, and Evan opened up about months of strange orders and late-night drilling shifts. Their voices carried the weight of fear, regret, and finally relief at being alive long enough to speak the truth. By dawn, the storm had softened into a steady snowfall. Jim opened the door. The landscape was buried under fresh drifts, the world blank and quiet. The workers stood behind him, exhausted but determined. Rex stepped into the snow, sniffing the air for danger. Jim guided the men down the ridge, and together they reached Winterhold by midday. Word spread faster than the wind. Jim Walker had rescued 3 Northfront employees in the deadliest blizzard of the year, and those employees carried evidence of corporate sabotage. Townspeople gathered around, offering blankets, hot drinks, and stunned gratitude. Dr. Bishop arrived quickly, jaw clenched in both fear and vindication as he saw the documents. Jim placed the metal case into Bishop's hands. The geologist whispered, "This changes everything." As the sun finally pierced the clouds in weak winter light, the story rushed across the region through radios, phones, and word of mouth. Northfront's image cracked, and Jim and Rex found themselves thrust unwillingly into the role of heroes. Rex stood proudly beside Jim, snow clinging to his dark coat, as Bishop announced the discovery to the council and the assembled townspeople. Jim felt no pride, only a growing determination. Winterhold finally had the truth, and Northfront knew it. The final town hearing took place under clear skies, an unusual break in Winterhold's brutal winter. The air was crisp, the sunlight reflecting off fresh snow in sharp glints that stung the eyes. Jim Walker stood outside the town hall beside Rex, adjusting the collar of his military cold-weather parka. People streamed inside the building with an energy that hadn't been present during earlier meetings, hope mixed with anger, determination blending with nervous anticipation. Jim felt the weight of the past week settle across his shoulders. Secret drilling, buried evidence, a blizzard that nearly claimed lives. Yet today felt different. Today the truth would breathe in open air. Rex remained close to Jim's left leg, posture steady, ears flicking with every voice around him. Inside the hall, Dr. Arlo Bishop arranged charts, samples, and printed data brought by the rescued workers. Mark Redden sat in the audience with a butterfly bandage over his healing forehead wound, wearing a borrowed winter coat far warmer than his old company jacket. Luis Carranza kept the metal case of documents locked between his hands, his dark, curly hair still stiffened by cold. Evan Holt sat wrapped in a thick blanket, cheeks flushed but finally healthy. Even with fear still lingering in their expressions, all three looked ready to speak. Jim took a seat near the front, Rex laying at his boots. He watched as Northfront's representatives entered, and this time they did so with noticeably less arrogance. Victor Lang no longer carried the polished composure he had flaunted in earlier hearings. His slick black hair was slightly disheveled, and though he wore the same charcoal suit, he carried himself differently. Tight shoulders, shallow breaths, darting glances. Carter Doyle, the muscular security man, followed behind him, beard untrimmed and jaw tight. Elena Rivers, usually composed, looked genuinely conflicted, her hazel eyes avoiding contact as if weighed down by truths she could not deny. Roland Tripp, the council chair, banged his gavel, calling the meeting to order. His thick eyebrows knitted as he scanned the crowd. "Today," Tripp announced, "we hear final statements regarding Northfront's operations. Evidence has been presented. Now we seek resolution." Dr. Bishop spoke first. He recapped the geological evidence in a calm but firm manner. Pressure collapse maps, vibrations from the hydrophone, sediment contamination. He pointed to photographs showing pump stations unauthorized by any permit. "This is environmental sabotage," he said, voice echoing in the hall. Then he gestured toward Jim. "Elias Walker discovered this decades ago. Jim Walker confirmed it. And these men," he motioned to the three rescued workers, "risked their lives to bring proof." Luis Carranza opened the metal case and distributed copies to the council members. Evan Holt stepped forward next. Though still pale, his voice carried a quiet strength as he described how supervisors pressured workers to ignore alarms. Mark Redden followed, recounting nights spent running pumps until the mountain sounded like it was crying out. Victor Lang attempted damage control. He stood, adjusted his tie, and spoke in a voice still smooth, but now cracking at the edges. "These claims are exaggerations," he began. "Northfront has always complied with operating standards. Any mishaps were isolated." But Elena Rivers suddenly rose beside him. Her hands shook as she cleared her throat. I need to speak." The hall quieted instantly. Victor's eyes flashed with panic. Elena continued, voice trembling yet resolute. "The internal reports they brought—" She pointed to the metal case. "They're real. I saw the signatures. Mine included." Gasps rippled through the hall. Northfront knew the pressure levels were unsafe. We were told to hide that information. Her confession cut through the room like cold steel. What happened next felt like the mountain itself exhaling. Council Chair Roland Tripp stood slowly, face stern. "Northfront Resources," he announced, "is hereby ordered to cease all operations on Black Ridge Peak effective immediately." Tripp looked toward Jim and Bishop. "A full investigation will follow. Your company will compensate Winterhold for damages, contamination, and unauthorized extraction." Victor Lang muttered something under his breath, but it no longer mattered. The crowd erupted, not in chaos, but in relieved applause. Mark Redden leaned back, eyes moist. Luis lowered his head, whispering thank you under his breath. Evan Holt let out a shaky exhale, shoulders loosening for the first time in months. And Rex barked once, the sound sharp and triumphant. Days later, with Northfront's machinery removed and their personnel gone, Jim hiked back up to the Black Ridge cabin with Rex at his side. The skies were calm, streaked with orange as the sun lowered over the distant horizon. Jim pushed open the cabin door, stepping into the quiet interior that now felt more like a sanctuary than a hiding place. The floor panel still led to Elias's hidden research room. Jim descended the rope ladder again, lantern in hand. The hydrophone machine sat exactly where he had left it. Rex followed, paws soft against the earth. Jim flipped the switch. First came static, then a tone, clear, steady, rhythmic, not the distressed rumble he had heard before. A healthy pulse, like water flowing freely through stone. Jim closed his eyes. The mountain was healing. The water vein Elias fought so hard to protect had regained its strength. Every beat of the hydrophone tone echoed what Elias had written long ago. The mountain has a voice. Listen. Jim exhaled deeply, letting peace settle into his bones. He remembered his grandfather's weathered face, the determined eyes that seemed to see through rock and time. Jim placed one hand against the basalt wall. It felt warm, alive in its own quiet way. Rex nudged Jim's side gently, tail swaying with content recognition. Jim smiled. He was right, he murmured. The mountain speaks. Winterhold moved quickly to honor Elias Walker's work. Within a week, volunteers arrived at the ridge to help rebuild the old cabin into a modest but sturdy research center. Dr. Bishop helped oversee the technical design, ensuring it could house equipment for monitoring the water veins. Jim worked alongside the townspeople, repairing beams, reinforcing the roof, and clearing snow from the perimeter. Rex patrolled the site, often receiving friendly pats from workers who now saw him as the dog who saved their town hall. Even the rescued workers returned, Mark carrying lumber with newfound purpose, Luis painting signs, Evan installing insulation with careful hands. A wooden plaque was mounted above the rebuilt doorway, Elias Walker Water Research Center. On the final evening before the center's official opening, Jim carved a message into the front step. He used his old field knife, gripping it with steady hands as he engraved each letter with care. Rex sat beside him, watching quietly as snowflakes drifted down. When Jim finished, he brushed away the shavings and read the words carved into the wood. Listen to what the mountain tells you. The last message of his grandfather, a warning, a legacy, a truth that saved a town. As dusk settled and lanterns glowed warmly from inside the cabin, Jim stood and looked over the ridge. The wind whispered across the snow, gentle now, almost like a voice. Rex leaned against Jim's leg, calm and loyal. Jim stepped inside the cabin-turned-research center and looked around at the transformed space. Maps on walls, instruments humming, townspeople laughing softly. For the first time in years, Jim felt not just useful but rooted. Winterhold wasn't merely a place to hide from memories. It was now a home built on purpose, truth, and resilience. Rex curled near the hearth, eyes slowly closing in the peace of a mountain finally healed. Jim placed Elias's notebook on the table, lit a lantern, and whispered quietly, "We heard you, old man." And we answered. At the end of everything Jim and Rex uncovered on that frozen mountain, one truth stood brighter than the Alaskan dawn. Miracles don't always roar. Sometimes they whisper. Sometimes they come as a vibration in the earth, a dog's warning bark, or a memory left behind by someone who loved us more than we realized. Many people say that's how God speaks. Not always in thunder, but in quiet moments, through instincts we cannot explain, through protection we didn't know we were given. And just like Jim learned, when we slow down long enough to truly listen, we begin to notice his guidance woven into our everyday lives, in the choices we make, in the people we meet, and in the courage to do what is right, even when nobody is watching. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs a little hope today. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from and which moment stayed with you. And if you believe God still works through ordinary people and through loyal companions like Rex, then please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and join us for more stories of faith, courage, and miracles. May God bless you, protect your steps, and fill your days with quiet miracles you never expected.